All right, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about databases. Well, more specifically, relational database management systems. There's quite a bit of databases out there, but we're going to be utilizing PostgreSQL as our database that we will interact with within the program. We're going to get a quick intro to it today, and later on we'll get a full week that really dives into SQL, how to interact with SQL, how to manage join tables, and write more efficient SQL queries to be able to grab the data that we want out of our database. Now, SQL is not necessarily the most challenging subject that there possibly is. Um, so it's very easy to overlook SQL, especially within the program. Please make sure that you're doing your due diligence to keep yourself refreshed in all the material that we cover. I know that it's a lot that gets shoved into the daily lecture. Then you have assignments, and on top of that, we're also asking you guys to do research to further your knowledge on things. But you want to make sure that you do not lose the things that we have already taught so far. So if it's already been 3 days since you've touched OP, or it's been a little bit longer since you've touched classes, at this point, you should be working on a little bit of OP assignments, maybe going back, redoing some of the assignments that we gave you, or you can even utilize AI to give you some ideas about some projects that you can complete in OP. But now that I've covered all the retention information about our program, let's go ahead and get into why we would want a relational database management system. So the first things where we're going to be, the topics that we'll be covering today will be why we want databases rather than utilizing something like Python and CSV. Then we'll see an example of utilizing a CSV file with Python to retain data, what the problems can arise from that. And then after that, we'll go into why use relational database management systems and how to use relational database management systems. All right. Does anyone have any questions over the topics that we'll be covering today? Okay, so before we actually start going into this portion of the lecture, does anyone have any experience with any SQL related database? And if so, what has been your experience with it? Go ahead, Landon.
Once upon a time before the Navy, I was a database analyst at a casino for a couple of years. So used to work in the query language and setting up like a development server on Microsoft at SQL.
That's awesome. Did you ever run into any issues with SQL, or what was the biggest challenge about working with SQL while you were working with that?
The biggest challenge was not locking up queries because the database was like primarily for analytics. So there'd be some long query runtimes that would prevent the end user from using that data set because we were piping the information to Power BI um, analytics like front end. So
That's awesome. All right, so if anyone has questions related to SQL later on, we know who to ask. All right, DJ?
Yeah, I've used MySQL, SQL Server, and some other databases. I think one of the biggest difficulties I remember, other than retention, because I've relearned SQL probably 4 times now, uh, and it's like separating when you should build stored procedures versus using code and whatnot.
Oh, awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Jay. And so now that we've covered a little bit of the background is, let's talk about how or why databases are important. So data is super important now, not only for us as software engineers, but I'm sure everybody knows that every single business revolves around data, right? For us in the development process, it's important to know about data because, well, even when you create an application, some of the decisions that are made behind color schemes, some of the decisions that are made behind why this site should be formatted in a specific way or why this button should be located in this specific part of the site is because there's been a development team or some sort of team that has collected that information by doing studies and finding out what grabs people's attentions. Right? There's different forms of data, and data has become pretty much like the new oil of um, of the industry. The more data you have, the better. And those people who control the data will more than likely control the future. There's this common misconception now that people think that Tesla is like designed for making sure that they can deliver like cars and stuff. Just because that's what most people see on the street, right? They see a car and they're like, oh, well, Tesla must be a car company. But Tesla is actually a data company. They collect data from every single trip done in those vehicles so that they can make better cars, or they can eventually make self-driving cars, as we can all see on the streets nowadays. I think here in Arizona, actually, the other day I was driving, and I'm not sure if they're related to any specific tech company as of right now. But there's self-driving cars now that just drive around, and they have this like rotating camera at the very top, and cameras coming out of pretty much every corner of the car. And the car looks super bulky. Doesn't look very pretty as of right now, but it is really cool to see that it's just a self-driving vehicle with the passenger just sitting in the back seat. All right. So now, next topic that we're going to cover is data consistency. Why is that important? Making sure that whatever data is coming into your database or whatever data it is that you're retaining stays consistent for everything. I'm sure there's some people here who have taken some sort of statistics class. Can anybody speak to that? Tell me why the consistency behind your data could be important, and what could be the repercussions of having data that does not consist with everything else.
Sure. Like any analysis you do for any reason needs to be easily reproducible by anyone, like not only in the organization, but outside of the organization. So for that reason, you want your data to all be in agreement with each other and easily reproducible.
All right, awesome. Yeah. So that's one part for us as developers. You want data to stay consistent, for a kind of a variety of reasons, right? So when we go to grab data out of our database, we need to make sure that data looks the same so that we have an expected return value from the database. If we did not have an expected return value from the database, we would have to manually go through that data, format it the way we want it to be formatted, and then afterwards return that to the front end, which just puts a much heavier load on the server than what we would like, right? Instead, we would want that data to stay clean, to already have some sort of validators, some sort of constraints, making sure that all of that data is staying the same. Now, I'm using these words like validators and constraints. We'll learn more about them later on. But I want everyone to kind of think back to getters and setters when we're working with Python. When we utilize getters and setters, we were basically telling our program that there is one specific way that information is supposed to enter the program, and information is supposed to exit the program for the user. Now, although we did it in Python, we did it manually, and we would have to do it manually for every single possible input. Meaning that string, if we wanted to collect someone's name, we would have to check that string manually and make sure that the name is formatted properly. We would have to make some sort of setter to make sure that age is being input properly. Emails, we would have to validate emails on our own by making sure that there's an @ and a .com sign. And although it doesn't sound like a heavy load, I'm sure we've all figured out that all those little things add up. And that ends up turning into a huge program of just validation. Well, most of the time, relational database management systems will have those tools already created for us so that we could just add that into our database and tell our database, hey, you are not to accept any input into this specific table that does not match the following requirements. And it just makes our data consistency a little bit simpler to manage. All right. Does anyone have any questions about why databases are important, and how to keep up with data consistency? Okay, if there are no questions, let's go ahead and take a look at the CSV module that we're going to be working with today before we actually start writing some code that will interact with the CSV module. So the CSV module is actually pretty simple. If we can take a look at it, all it is a simple table where we have all of our IDs. We have a first name, last name, an age, and a grade. And it looks like this is student-related data. So all of these are just students inside of a school with their age and their grade in a specific class. Nothing too complicated. It's done on purpose so that we could write a quick program for it. But let's take a look at what it would look like if we wanted to create some sort of OOP related Python script that will interact with this file. At this point, we all know OOP, and I'm more than confident in everyone's ability to be able to walk me through being able to create a file that can unpack the CSV module and read from it. I'll do the writing, but for now, let's go ahead and worry about reading from the CSV module. So starting off with our class, what would our class look like if this is our CSV file? Go ahead, Brian.
We could call it class student. And just basically in the init function, we could do a dunder init, and then that could take in just match the names from the CSV file, first name, last name, age, grade.
Okay, so we have ID, first name, last name, age, and grade. Awesome. All right. Can anybody, someone other than Brian, walk me through creating? So these are currently parameters that are going to be passed into my class instance. How do I turn these parameters into actual instance attributes?
You can say self.id equals ID. Self.firstname equals first name. And then the same with last name as well as, is it age and grade?
Perfect. Okay, great. So now we have our class that's able to take in the CSV information so that we could see it, we could manipulate it on the right-hand side. Okay, great. Well, now I want to be able to open the CSV file. And when I open the CSV file, I want to create class instances for each one of these students. How can I do that?
Would you have to basically load or unpack the data from the CSV first?
Yeah, awesome. So if I'm working with CSVs, what kind of what do I have to import from Python to be able to work with CSVs?
CSV, import CSV.
All right, perfect. So now I'm importing CSV, and now I'm going to go ahead and actually create the method that will read the student data. Okay. Let's make this a class method because we know that this is going to create classes. Let's have it take in a file path. All right. How do I go about opening this file with my CSV reader and creating instances from said file?
Wouldn't you start with open and actually with the string of dot slash data slash file name?
Okay, so we know that we want to that would be the file path that gets in here. Okay. What else?
And then, and if you have the proper file path and naming it as CSV file. The next line would be that your reader equals CSV dot dict reader as one word, and then parentheses CSV file.
Okay, what is
So-
CSV file?
I have CSV file as one word, but it's actually that's so in the context that I'm looking at, it's actually the name of the that has been assigned to the CSV file. So on the
So you're saying to do something like this, after I open that file, I need to tell my with open, what is it that it's going to reference this file as, right? So we're
correct
gonna reference that file CSV. Okay,
yeah, as a file name.
all right, awesome. And then, Saul, what's your question?
Don't you need what method you're going to be opening it with, whether it's read or write?
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I gonna declare a mode, whether I want to read or write from the CSV file. What else?
Need the new line
Line.
equals empty.
Nice. So new line, when to identify that I'm starting a new line. Okay, so my with open function is now complete. I'm able to grab my reader and turn each individual line into a dictionary. Okay, awesome. Now reader is a list of dictionaries, each one representing an individual row within my CSV. So now, how do I turn each one of these dictionaries into class instances?
For a row in reader colon. The next line being if file name equals, actually double equals, and then whatever the CSV file name is in single quotes.
Well, we only have one file. So what would be the purpose of checking the file path?
Just to confirm that the file has loaded properly or exists in that path.
Okay, so let's say if students in file path. All right. All right, Steven, what would be the next line? So I have my row. How do I create that row, which is just a dictionary, into a student instance?
When you take each individual student and have that row print out each information. So it'll be student equals student in parentheses row, and then that way it's printing out each row for each individual student.
Okay, it's you said printing out, or
I mean, well, not printing, but it's taking each row of the student and making an
Okay.
individual row.
Awesome. What do I do with the student now? Because I would like this function to return a list of student instances.
you append it to the list afterwards. So you would take that that row and then just append it over to the empty list.
Okay, so you're saying I want to create an empty list first, right?
Yeah.
So let's say student list. And then I can say student list dot append student. All right. So that takes care of this information. Finally, once this is over, I can go ahead and return my student list. So we just created a method that will allow me to open my file and look at the information, create some class instances, and return them. Well, let's make a quick function here that will run when I execute this file. Let's say it's going to be named main because it's going to be ran at the main level of the file. And let's make the file path be equal to /resources /data.csv. And then finally, I'm going to say that students is equal to the student class dot read students. And I'm going to pass in the file path that we've declared. Okay, so that's going to trigger this function so far. Now all I'm going to do is actually work with this information, right? I want to be able to create a terminal that will allow me to manipulate some information. So I'm going to say while true, then all I'm going to do is print student management system. Where the option 1 will be to view students. Option 2 will be to add a student. Option 3 will be to delete a student. And then finally, option 4 will just be to exit. Now I can manage all this information on my own, right? I have these students already created. It's all within the student's path. Well, if I wanted to say, oh, this should be input. I apologize. So let's go ahead and make an input statement here. And this input statement is just going to say, enter your choice. Then I could say if choice is equal to 1. But what do I want to do if the choice is equal to 1? It's saying view students. So how can I view all of my students inside of my student list? And I'll go ahead and throw that question over to Kirk.
You would do for student in that one list you made.
So in students, all right.
Yeah. And then print student.
Okay. Now, the way you have it here, what is this going to print? Remember, this is a list of class instances. So when I go to trigger this print statement, what would that show me?
You would have the file location.
Right, would have the memory location. So how do I change that?
You would have to make the understring.
All right, so let's make that real quick. Do we want a dunder string or a representation string?
I'm not sure, but
Okay.
think string should work.
Okay, what do we want in this string?
Just the labels with the ID, first name, last name, age, grade, and then in brackets the each variable.
Okay, let's do ID. Now let's do self dot first name. Self dot last name. Okay, then finally let's do age. And actually, I'm just going to go ahead and make a new line for each one of these. That way we're not getting too much input in one line. And then the last one would be, I believe, grade. Okay, so now we have all this information. It's going to be able to return it. And that's what we see when the print statement is triggered. Okay. Adding a student and deleting a student. So let's say if choice is equal to 2. And Eric, can you walk me through creating a method or just creating something that would add a student into this class?
Yeah, would we be able to use a dunder string here? Or
I want to create a student instance and add it into the students list.
okay, hold on one sec. So make a variable called field names
Okay, so field names.
equals square brackets, and then input all the parameters from up top. So ID, first name.
Okay.
And actually, can you change the square brackets to the what's it called?
Curly's.
Yeah, curly brackets. Yep. And then actually, I want to change the all the parameters to self.id, self.first name, self.last name.
Okay.
So add a self.
What
or,
is self in reference to in this case?
To the, in my head, it's gonna reference to the new student.
Got it. Yeah, so we don't need self in this case because we're not actually working with the student just yet. We're just creating a dictionary within the function. So there's no student just yet.
Okay. And then ID would be row. Or row square brackets, and then now would it be self.id or first?
No. So this is for the user, right? Whoever's utilizing this would input the ID here.
So could you put an input
Yeah, definitely.
input there?
Yeah.
And then it'll ask what is the new ID? And then it'll be the same thing for the rest of the parameters. And then I think for the field names variable, I think a better variable would be new student.
Okay. So let's change this variable here and turn it into new student. All right. So we have all that information. How do we create a student instance and then add it into our student list?
So it would be, so you'd have to make the key first, or no, it's a list. So, would you just append it to the new list or the student
Okay.
list? So, student list, or yeah, students that append new student.
Okay, but new student's a dictionary, right? And what we want to append is an instance of the student class. So what do I want to change here?
So you would want mm, would you make a would you put a so you're gonna put the student class and then parentheses, and then would you put all the parameters? So ID.
We could do it like that, or we could just deconstruct the dictionary. Awesome. And then we could print new student was added. Okay. Great. So now we have all this information. We were able to successfully add a student. Well, now how do we handle the next one? What if the choice is 3? When the choice is 3, thank you for that catch, Donnie. Got to turn him into a string. All right, awesome. So now when the choice is 3, what I want to do is delete a student. So now let's go ahead and go with, sorry, I'm trying to see somebody who doesn't usually volunteer. Sean, can you walk me through creating choice 3 of deleting a student from our list of students?
Yeah, so can you, or I'm just trying to think. We'll need to get the name of the student, so like probably student to delete. Equals input, and then you'll want to ask for the ID of the student you want to delete.
All right.
And then from there in the students list, You would want to I think you should be able to we need a method to be able to get the student ID or like search the student list for the student by student ID potentially.
Okay, so let's say new list of students is equal to a new list. Let's say for stud in students. Okay, so now what do I want to do?
Oh, okay. So if student ID, like yeah, like that, is not equal to the student to be deleted, append to the new list.
Okay. And then we could just reset the student's value, right? We could use variable reassignment. How do I do that?
Students equals new list of students.
Okay, great. And now we could just say student was successfully removed, right?
Yes.
All right, so student is successfully deleted. And then finally, we can say elif choice is equal to 4. Or we can break out, and I can say print goodbye. Break the function that I'm currently in. And then else I can just handle improper input. Okay, so now I have my menu. And now I'm just going to create a method for writing into my CSV data. Let's go ahead and create that method. We haven't done this before, so I'm going to go ahead and take over here and write this method for us. So I'm going to write a class method that will write student data. It's going to be a class, and it's going to take in a file path. Okay. All I'm going to do is this class method is going to take in the file path and the students. So the new list of students that we're going to give it. And I'm going to open up my file. I'm going to open it up in writing mode, not reading mode. So W's for writing. And I'm still going to tell it to end each new line with an open parentheses. I'm going to go ahead and name this CSV file. Rather than reader, I'm going to call it writer. And we can see that we have CSV writer. There's a way to utilize dict writer. We could experiment with it later on, but that's not something that I'm currently prepared for, and I'm not sure if we want to do that. It may get in the way of the lesson, so let's go ahead and utilize writer for now. And I'm going to go ahead and take the CSV file. Okay. Now I can actually write inside of the CSV file. So I can tell it that I want to write. A row. This is going to be my first row, which I know will be the ID, first name, last name, the age, I believe is the next thing, and then finally the grade. So when I go to save something in my CSV file, I'm essentially rewriting the entire file from scratch. Okay, so that's going to write my first row. Then after that, I can iterate through my students. So for stud in students, and I can write a row. So writer.write row. And inside of this row, I can pass in student ID, student first name, student last name, student age, and student grade. Okay, so there's my writer. I'm going to go ahead and look at my files here, and I'm going to make a new file. This is going to be results.csv, so we can separate those two CSV files. And I'm going to come over to my path and say results path should be equal to resources slash results.csv. So when someone goes to quit, I want to make sure that gets saved into my writer path, right? Well, I'm going to go ahead and call the student class dot write student data. I'm going to pass in my results path as my first argument because we know that it can take in the path and students. And then my second argument will be the students that I've created. Okay, so now I did all of this coding. We were able to create this path and this menu. Well, what happens now when I run my information? Let's take a look here. I'm going to go ahead and run Python students.py. Oh, I actually forgot to call my function. Call it again. Okay, so there we see student management system. It has my choices. Okay, if I type in anything, it's not going to work, just like we expected. If I want to view all of the students, I don't think it worked. Let's see. If choice is equal to 1, which I am passing 1, for stud and students print stud. We do have our string method. So maybe it's not actually grabbing students. Let's go ahead and print students here. Okay, so it's not unpacking students the way it's supposed to. So there's something going on here in my dict reader.
The line 22.
Line 22. It could be that. Yep, there it is. So now it's working. Okay. Awesome. Let me go ahead. Okay, we don't need to do that. All right, let's go ahead and say we want to view the students. We can see each individual student record there. We have each one from my student file. And let's go ahead and add a student. Well, when I add a student and it asks me for an ID, the reasonable thing would do to something like 1, right? Let's say that I do something like I add a student with the ID of 1, name it Francisco, Avila, and then his age is, I don't know, 12, and the grade that they're currently in is 6. Okay, well now let's go ahead and take a look at the students. So here we have Francisco. All right, Francisco Avila, he has the ID of 1, grade of 6. But now we have 2 students that have the ID of 1. Well, what happens when I go to delete one of those students with the method that we created, right? Let's say I make my choice to be delete a student. So I say 3. All right, well, now I want you to delete a student, and I want you to delete student with the ID of 1. It gives me, hey, student was deleted successfully. Okay, well, now let me see all of my students again. When I'm taking a look at all of my students, I enter the choice of 1. It starts with ID of 2. And yes, Francisco was removed, but so was my first student that I didn't mean to remove. So now I'm running into the issue of duplicate IDs. Okay. Awesome. Let me go ahead and add the Francisco again. Let's say I wanted to keep Francisco. Well, what if I accidentally clicked Q instead of 1? And now my new student first name, here I'm going to go ahead and place Francisco again, but I typed it in wrong. And Avila, and age, let's put 22. Okay, and the student grade is 9th. I'm not even sure if that's how you spell it right now. Okay, and it says, well, my student was successfully added. And if I do the choice of 1, what's going on here? We just talked about the importance of data consistency, but the format in which Francisco was inputted doesn't match the format of any of my other choices at all. Right, some of these are, all of them have been capitalized properly. Francisco hasn't. All right, for a grade, it's looking for a letter grade, but instead I put in the grade that they're currently in. For age, they're usually numeric, and I'm putting in something that's alphabetic. Well, now that's all messed up. I'm not able to control what that input is. I could create getters and setters, but just creating this program alone already took us about 20 to 30 minutes to create. All right, well, now that I did this, what happens when I click on the number 4? Okay, it tells me goodbye. My data CSV, which is my original CSV data, stayed, so I didn't corrupt any of my original data. But now let's take a look at results. So results was able to create an ID, but look at the consistency there. All right, we see that there's something wrong here. This isn't the information that I wanted. Let's run this again. I take a look at my students. This is all coming in from my original file. So now my original file has John one more time. And let's say that I want to delete a student. The only reason why I logged in here is to delete Michael. So I'm going to go ahead and pass in 5, pass in the ID of 1. So we can see 1, 2, 3, and 4, and Michael has been removed. Okay, great. Well, what happens if somebody interrupts my program, or there's a shortage or whatever, and my program gets killed? My program was killed. Data CSV still has Michael, but results doesn't have Michael anymore, right? Or sorry, results still has Michael and it still has Francisco, even though both of these are supposed to be removed now. And that's because here in students, the only time that I'm rewriting the CSV is after line 74. Now, I could make this writing function to happen after every time that something gets altered, but that would make my script kind of heavy and it would have some repetitive motion that's not entirely necessary. So there's a couple of problems with this method, right? We've messed around with CSV so far, and we were able to use Python to interact with our CSV data, but that's not necessarily the best method to persist data, right? It's not persisting, and it's not consistent. We're not able to control the data flow, the data input that we want. So although this is something that we may be comfortable with now, this isn't how we want to do this. And in part 2 of our lecture, we're going to go over how interacting with our CSV files through a database is much simpler and gives us a lot more control. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions about the problems of interacting with CSV files through a Python script? Go ahead, Natalie.
Can you go over the writing student data method that you created again?
Yeah, of course. So this write a student data method, it's a class method, meaning that it can be utilized by the class or an instance. It's going to take in a file path where I will store my results, or once my program is done, it's going to store my data so the next time it starts, it's able to grab the newly updated information. And then it's going to grab students. This students is going to be the list of students that my program passes in when it gets killed. It's going to open up the file with a specific file path. I'm telling it to open up results here. And I'm telling it that instead of opening this file in reading mode, I want it to open in writing mode. And I'm still telling it that at the end of every line, I want there to be a new line. So just like here in CSV data, we identify that we know we're in a new line because there's an empty space and it moves into the next one. We're telling results to replicate that information. Once it's done writing a row, it moves into the next line rather than just continuously writing all in line one. After that, I give this an alias. So I'm telling it, I want you to open this file. It grabs that file, but it doesn't know how it's supposed to be referenced. So I'm saying it as CSV file. So now it knows that every time I talk about CSV file, I'm talking about the file that I opened. After that, I'm going to tell my writer to use csv.writer, which is going to allow me to actually write rows into my CSV. Here on line 30, you can see that I'm using the write row function. And that very first row is just my headers. I'm just writing headers into my CSV. ID, first name, and last name. And then after that, I'm iterating through each individual student. And by iterating through each student, for each student, I'm writing a row with the independent values that match those headers. Does that answer your question, Natalie?
Yes, thank you.
Of course, no problem. Terrence?
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify. So in 28, the new line portion is saying, hey, like start a new line whenever you encounter a space at the end of a line. Am I understanding that correctly?
This new line here is saying that once I'm done writing a row, it is to start a new line. If I were to remove that that variable, then we would look something like this. That's how I would have wrote it into my CSV file if I didn't have that new line variable. Does that answer your question, Terrence?
It does. Thank you.
Of course. All right. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions. With that said, we're going to take a short break. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Before we left on break, we saw a quick example of how we could work with CSV files, utilizing Python to kind of manage our data and keep our data inside of a CSV file. But we saw the many problems that can come with that. A CSV file is essentially just an Excel sheet. It will take any input, it will, and it won't have any sort of validation as to what should be happening or when it should be happening. So let's go ahead and talk about Postgres. So I'm going to actually go ahead and open up another terminal here. And I'm going to place that terminal up above. Now here, what we're going to do is we're going to actually enter Postgres. So we're going to talk about a packet, something that came in built in once we installed Postgres, which is psql. Psql is not something that's specific to PostgreSQL. You can talk to any database server or a lot of database servers utilizing psql. The main detail about psql is that if you don't specify what it is that you want it to connect to, it's going to assume that it just wants to connect to Postgres or connect to port 5432. Which we'll see what's running on port 5432 here shortly. So if I just type in PSQL, it's going to tell me, hey, there's a connection error. There's no such thing. Or on 5432, you have PostgreSQL running. But I can't enter because there's no database named Francisco Avila, which is true. I never created a database for my user. So instead, I'm going to go ahead and run psql Postgres because I know that PostgreSQL comes in with Postgres already built into it. Now we can see that I was able to enter. So I'm utilizing PSQL version 14.8. I'm within a homebrew package. Here we go, 14. Server major, all of this stuff really doesn't matter to me. It's just giving me a warning saying, hey, maybe it's time to upgrade. I don't necessarily need it, but now I'm within Postgres. Now there's a couple of commands that I want to discuss within the Postgres server. This is not Linux, right? I can't write something like clear. I can't do something like Python and try to enter my Python terminal. I can't run node. As a matter of fact, none of these are going to work because it doesn't know when to execute a command until you place a semicolon. And once I place that semicolon, it's going to give me a syntax error because it has no idea what to do with the keyword of clear. All right. So again, I am not within Linux. I am within Postgres now, which means that the only thing that Postgres will accept is actual commands that are related to the database or commands that are related to Postgres itself. So let's go over a couple of commands. If I want to see all of the databases or all of the data tables that are currently listed, oh, that was the wrong one. I apologize. Within Postgres, I can run -d. And it will tell me if they have any tables related to the Postgres database. And it tells me I don't. Here we can see that I have a bunch of databases currently running. I have a couple of template databases, test database. I should probably kill some of these databases sooner rather than later. I apologize, everyone. But now let's go ahead and actually go into recording. So I see that I have a students database here. I don't actually want to use that. So instead, I'm going to actually drop it. So I'm going to say drop database. And I'm going to specify the name, which is students. And then I'm going to place a semicolon right after that. Well, now when I run this command, it's going to tell me, hey, I dropped a database. Now if I run /L to look at all the different databases existing within my PostgreSQL, I can see that students is no longer here. Okay, good. So here's my list of databases. It tells me the name of the database. It tells me the owner, which is always going to be me, the user, as long as they're inside of my local machine. The encoding just means what kind of coding there is to secure my data, which is UTF-8. Collate and C-type, we're not really going to go into that just yet. And then it has a little bit of access privileges. All right. Now that I know that information, let's go ahead and create that students database then. For creating that students database, I'm going to run the create database command, and I'm going to name it students. Notice that I'm not capitalizing the name of my database and that none of my databases in my list are capitalized. Please do not put a capital letter for your database. PostgreSQL or Postgres in general has a huge problem dealing with capital letters within naming conventions. Give me a second, Edge, real quick. Let me go ahead and run this command. When I run create database, we see that a database has been created. I run \L to take a look at my list. And now I see that students populates all over again. All right. Edge, what question?
Yeah, in your delete example, you didn't capitalize database, and then in create you did. Is there a reason for that?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so let's talk about capitalization, right? So within PostgreSQL, you can write keyword commands either in lowercase or in capital letters. And Postgres itself doesn't care. The majority of times it's recommended that any keyword commands are capitalized, and that's just for other developers. So that if anybody picks up your SQL queries or picks up your SQL file, they can easily identify which words or which key commands are actually being passed and which ones are not key commands and are actually variables or things that are being interchanged within the command. Does that answer your question, Etch?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Terrence?
Sorry, would you mind repeating what the \d command did?
Yeah, definitely. So now when I run \d, it would show me any tables living within this database. Oh, that was the wrong terminal. I apologize. And it tells me that I currently don't have any tables living within the Postgres database. All right. Now, currently, I'm inside of the Postgres database, but I created the students table or the students database. Now I want to be able to access students before I start running any of my commands because I'm inside of the wrong database right now. So what I'm going to run is \c, which stands for connect. What I want to do is I want to connect to students. And then I'm going to run my semicolon. Okay, so now it tells me, all right, you ran this command. It gives me the same warning about Homebrew and psql. And then it tells me you are now connected to database students as the user, Francisco Avila. And I can see that my database name changed from Postgres into students. All right. I can still run the \d command. And I can see that I currently don't have any databases included in my SQL file. Does anyone have any questions about this so far? Go ahead, Edge.
Sorry, the hand was still up.
No, no problem at all. Go ahead, Saud.
So this is kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, it looks kind of similar to like a directory and then a file inside of a directory. Is that similar to what's happening right now?
It's similar, right? We could think about it as in a PostgreSQL being a entire system, and then each individual database being a directory, and then each table having having directories inside of it. The thing is that that's not necessarily what's going on. It's a good comparison, right? To think about it that way, and rather than thinking about utilizing the cd command to change your current location or change directories, you utilize the /c to be able to change between each individual database. But think about PostgreSQL as its own system. It's not, don't think about it as if it were part of your computer. It's running within your computer, but it does not work the same as your actual operating system. Does that make sense, though?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. I see a question from Tyler on the chat. I'm going to go ahead and take that over and post it into our Whiskey Questions channel. And I see psql is separate shell, correct? Yes, that's right. It's a completely separate shell. It's not running bash, it's not running ZSH. It's actually running something completely different that is only to interact with the currently running database at whatever address it is that you told it to run at. I see a question from Natalie. What does the /c mean? Are you switching what database you are in? That's right. So /c means connect. And what I'm doing is I'm telling it which database is it that I wanted to connect to. Originally, I was in Postgres. And after running /c to students, I connected to the students database. Does that answer your question, Natalie?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. All right, I see a couple of people typing on the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and give it a couple of seconds before I continue moving forward with the lecture. Okay, we got a question from Adrian. Would it be safe to say that PostgreSQL is just a way to manipulate the RDBMS? PostgreSQL is a RDBMS. So RDBMS stands for Relational Database Management Systems, but there's many of them. So there's MySQL, there's PostgreSQL, and there's a couple of other SQL related databases. Does that answer your question, Adrian?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we got a question from Cass. I appear to not have installed Postgres properly during the install phase. I have a Windows machine. Oh, thank you so much, Cass. Yes, if anybody runs into any sort of Postgres issues during this lesson, we are going to talk about it afterwards. We'll break out the breakout rooms and then we could meet during lunch so that we could get your operating system set up properly. Michael?
Yeah, sorry, I figured it'd be quicker just to ask. So like we're connecting to different databases and I guess my question is, are we able to connect to more than one or is it just we only work within a single database at a time? Like a database being a collection of those tables, or I guess just making sure I have a concrete understanding.
Okay, yeah, I think I understand your question. Can I connect to multiple databases at one and alter data in both of them at once? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay, so the answer to that is no, right? And even if you could, you wouldn't necessarily want to do that. You want to make sure that you isolate your behavior as much as possible, especially when we're talking about Postgres or any sort of database. When commands on databases are executed, there's most of the time there's no going back. It's very hard to back up your data unless you're using something like Amazon Web Services where it's actually backing up your data for you consistently. But it is super important that when you run a SQL query, you know exactly what it's going to do and why you're doing it. Because once it gets processed and the data changes at the production level, that data is gone. Whatever data you lost is gone. Whatever alteration you made to the data is happening. There's no going back. Does that answer your question?
Yep, makes sense. Yeah, for the integrity and doing the backups makes complete sense. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Okay, awesome. The next tool that we're going to be presenting here is going to be called Draw SQL. And I can probably drop this link here on the chat just so that everyone has it. And I'll also put it inside of the Whiskey channel. I personally like using drawing tools or anything that lets me visualize my actual database schema. As previously said, I'm a visual learner, so for me, it's important to be able to see the information that I'm trying to process. So now I'm going to go ahead and click New Diagram because I want to make a new diagram for my database that will represent my students. So here I'm going to have my students database. I am utilizing PostgreSQL, and I'm going to create this diagram. It gives me a blank sheet. Not really anything. Well, let's see what happens when I click on this new table. It gives me the option to create an actual table that I can alter and name as I please. So let's say I want to create a student, right? The student should have an ID. And the ID will always be taken care of for us. It's going to be something automatic that Postgres will take care of. That way we don't have to worry about duplicate IDs. We don't have to worry about IDs increasing. We can manually override the way Postgres is handling IDs if we wanted to reset a specific customer to a place within our database. But other than that, SQL will take care of the default behavior for us. So now let's take a look at our CSV file over here. And I'm going to turn this into something nice and pleasant to the eye so that I can actually look at it and identify what I'm trying to do. We have the ID row, which has already been taken care of for us. The next one that I want to create is going to be a first name. So I'm going to go ahead and write first name. And I can see that it tells me different types that I can utilize. Well, a first name isn't a big integer, or it's not an integer overall. And if I delete it, it gives me the different data types that exist within Postgres. I'm not going to cover all of them, but obviously we have Boolean, which, as we know, is true or false. We have char, which is a space for characters up to 255, but we can set a limitation as to how many characters we can take in. We have a date format, which is going to ensure that anything inputted into the database falls into the date format that it's asking for. We have decimal, where we can specify how many decimal places we should have and how many total number of integers we should have. So this number 8 would be 4 solid numbers, point, and then 2 following afterwards. For a 6 solid numbers and then 2 decimal places afterwards, for a total of 8 digits. We have double precision, which is just an exact number. We have float, which works exactly the same way as decimal. And it can take in a couple of other ones, right? We have some JSON that we can take in if we really wanted to store JSON. We have some line string, some multi-line string, a small integer. It brings up character one more time, and there's text. These are the two main ones that you utilize to take in any sort of string method or anything that's actually string and that you don't really have a format for it. The main difference between the two is that varchar has a limitation as to how many characters you can place in, which is 255, while text does not. Text does not have any sort of limitation to it. Time can be a little tricky because the way that Postgres takes in time is not the same way that other frameworks interpret time. So sometimes if you're utilizing a timestamp somewhere, you'll have to format it correctly before placing it into the database. We have our timestamps. We won't go into UUID, and I'll let you guys go ahead and familiarize yourselves with the remaining of these data types. Okay, so now that we discussed everything that we just talked about, we know that our first name should be a character with some sort of limitation. But then look at it right here on the right-hand side. It gives me a couple of options. It tells me, well, should this be nullable? Meaning that should I be able to input something in the database where this is blank, where there's nothing existing in this entry? Well, I know that for the ID, it's important for me to make sure that every single student has an ID. So I know that's not going to be nullable. And first name, well, that's something that I need to know, right? Well, it gives me a couple of other options that I can do here. I can say, hey, this is a primary key, which we'll go into primary keys and primary key references during the week that we discuss Postgres. But I can also make something unique. I can say, hey, no entry of one student should have the same first name. We know that that's not realistic, right? But let's say we were taking in something like student emails. Well, we know no entry of 2 students should have the same email. All right. So we have our first name, which is a character. I'm going to go ahead and create a last name, which will also be a character. We have our age, which in this case, I'm going to go ahead and say that it's an integer rather than a big integer. And then a grade, which again should be a character. And that is it. That's our entire database table, right? This is all we want in the table to be reflected. That is all the information that is being given to us. Does anyone have any questions over how I turn the CSV file and headers into a database table? Or at least a diagram of my database table so far? Okay, perfect. If there are no questions, then let's move on into actually creating this database table within Postgres. So SQL queries are actually pretty simple because they're very similar to just plain English. What I want to do is I want to create a table. So the command for creating a table is create table. The next argument will be what is the name that I want to give it? Well, I want to give it students. And when I create this table And I'm actually just gonna go with student. No, it should be students. Yeah, that shouldn't cause an issue as far as naming convention. And then after that, I'm gonna go ahead and open up some parentheses so that I can specify the arguments or the different table headers that my table should have. Well, the first one, as we discussed, before I keep moving forward, I want to make sure that we all realize this. So this is my first entry. It has an equal sign and an ampersand. And notice how when I pressed enter, I had an open parentheses, and now it's telling me, hey, you're running a command, and this is the opening bracket. This is where you're currently at. I am within a command execution, and it's waiting for arguments. Well, I know that I want to give it an ID, and this is going to be a serialized primary key. Right, just like we discussed here, I have a primary key. Okay, perfect. The next thing that I'm going to pass in will be the first name. And just like we discussed, this should be a char or a varchar, whichever one you would like to use. And I can pass in how many characters I would like it to take in. Let's go ahead and go with 20. Then I'm going to go ahead and go with last name. Oh, I have capital letters on. Again, that's a variable. Here is the keyword of character. And I'm going to go ahead and go with 20 again. Finally, I can pass in the age, which we specified should be an integer. And then last, we should have a grade, which should be a character no greater than 1. Since this is my last argument, I am not going to place a comma after it. Lastly, I'm going to go ahead and close my argument and place a semicolon next to it. Before I execute this command, does anyone have any questions over how this diagram here creates into the SQL query for creating a table? Terrence?
After students and that opening parentheses, like did you just press enter after students? The line above, there you go. So did you have just press enter after students and that opening parenthesis happened automatically, or did you have to manually type that in?
That's correct. I just press enter after this opening parentheses, and SQL knows that I am passing an argument to the database. So to let me know that it's tracking that I'm working in an argument, it puts an open parentheses with an ampersand next to it. Does that answer your question?
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I don't see anything on the whiskey questions. Oh, I actually do see something from Michael saying serial is only for ID. Not all of the time. We'll talk into what serial does under the hood later on. But typically for any sort of primary key or ID, you're always going to want to add the serialization to it as well. Does that answer your question, Michael?
Yes.
All right. Okay, perfect. So now I'm going to go ahead and press enter, and we're going to see that a table was created. Well, before, when I ran the \d command, I got that it didn't find any relationships. But now, if I run \d, it's going to tell me, hey, I found this public students, which is a table, and then I have the student ID sequence. That's interesting. I never made a student ID table sequence, but it was created for me. Well, that's because I passed in that this was a serial primary key. When I told it that this was a serialized primary key, Postgres said, okay, so you want me to take care of serializing the ID for you, and you also want me to take care of ensuring that they are unique and that they are a primary key. So I created a table that will take care of that for me. That way, every time there is a new student entry, Postgres knows how to handle that ID placement unless I manually tell it how to handle it. All right. So now I have this table. Well, how do I take a look at how many students are within the table? Or how do I even see what's inside of the table? Well, this is where we're going to run into the very basic SQL query of select all. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and say I want to select everything. And by everything, I'm just going to place a star. I'm going to tell it from students. That's all I'm going to tell it. I'm going to say I want you to grab any information, anything and everything that exists from the students table. Well, now when I execute this command here, we can see I have 0 entries. There's no students currently living within this table, but it's showing me my headers of ID, first name, last name, age, and grade. Does anyone have any questions up to this point? All right, well, now I created this database, but how do I tell my program to grab the information from data and place it inside of the database that or inside of the data table that I currently created? Well, here inside of my Linux terminal that's still attached to my operating system, right? I'm inside of ZSH here. I'm going to go ahead and change directory into resources. And if I run ls, it's going to show me data.csv. I'm currently in the directory where data.csv is located. And I'm going to need this information because I'm going to currently tell Postgres where to find the CSV data in order to copy it into my table. So now within Postgres, within SQL, I'm going to run the following command. I want you to copy data into students from, and now it needs to know where is it supposed to copy data from. Well, now if I run pwd inside of my actual computer, my OS, I can grab this path, copy it, paste it over, and then add /data.csv. And that's going to finish my entire path over to my CSV file. From there, just like the open function, it needs to know what the delimiter is. All right, if we take a look at Python over here, and we take a look at our PY, oh, we didn't specify a delimiter. I thought we did. We didn't specify a delimiter. Okay. Well, in PSQL, we need to specify what a delimiter is. And a delimiter is just essentially what is it that separates each individual or part of data per entry. And I'm going to tell it that what it separates it is a comma. So I'm going to say delimiter, which I always spell incorrectly, will be a comma. And if we take a look at data.csv, we can see that there is a comma between each argument that's being passed in. Okay, so now the next question is, how does it know what to correspond each individual entry to? How does it know that 1 belongs to ID? How does it know that John belongs to first name, Doe to last name, that A belongs to grade? Or how does it even identify that the very first line isn't an actual entry that's supposed to go into my database? Well, within PSQL, I'm going to tell it that the CSV headers are going to be included by just saying CSV header. This is going to tell SQL that the very first line within my CSV file are the headers and to match each line under it to the independent entry. Does anyone have any questions about this command? Go ahead, Edge.
Your use of students, when you put copy students from, does the actual word you use there matter, or where did that students come from?
Yeah, it's a great question. This students is in reference to the data table students.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Kara?
Yeah, just if you didn't have like a header date, like header information in your CSV, would you be able to upload data from a CSV? Like say it was formatted correctly for your table, would it know to automatically sort it by like if it was in the same order?
Yes. So to answer your question is what if the CSV headers weren't in there and but the data was formatted properly? Now, the way that it's going to work, it's just going to go from left to right. And it's just going to simply read from left to right as if those were the entries for each individual argument. So if everything matches this format here, ID, first name, last name, age, and grade, you could work with a CSV file without having the CSV header. Does that answer your question?
It does. Just to follow up on that,
Mhm.
if you did have headers that were in the wrong order, would it still read like is it still reading the same way? It's just reading left to right and it's just ignoring the headers. Is that what's happening there?
If I did have headers and they were mismatched, I could have my headers in the mismatched. And as long as the data falls into the correct header, when this command gets executed in SQL, it'll put them in the right spot. Kind of like **dict does whenever we're working with dictionaries.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Terrence, do you have a question or is your hand just still up?
Sorry, I didn't realize it was still.
Okay, awesome. And I think there was someone else that had their hand up. All right, I see someone typing on the chat, so I'm going to give it a couple seconds here while they type on the chat.
I do got a quick, like, off the wall question.
Yeah, go ahead, Donnie.
So like this is a lot of typing, right? So say you like do a typo. Is there a way to like, if you mess up, is there a way to like not have to retype all of this in and get it to come back? Like an
Yeah.
undo?
Yeah, that's definitely a good question. We'll go into that here shortly once we start talking about SQL files.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I see a question from David saying the CSV header in the SQL command is to specify we want to use the headers from the CSV file. With the question mark. Yes. So we're telling SQL that it should match the headers to the arguments that are currently inside of this table. All right. We're going to go ahead and push forward now. We're going to run this command here. Let's see what it does. So it tells me that it copied 5 entries from the CSV data. Let's take a look. I got 5 entries. So now when I run the same SQL query that I ran before of select all from students. Oh, of course I can't spell. We can see that we have all of the students from our CSV data being inputted or being entered into our database correctly. All right, so now at this point, we have our entire database working. Okay, great. So now that I have this information, I can go ahead and start talking about SQL files. Because just like Donnie just mentioned in his question, we've been doing a lot of typing. Well, what happens if that typing goes wrong? What happens if I make a syntax error or somewhere along the line I mess up and I need to go back to reference this information? Well, that's where SQL files come in. SQL files work exactly like the database entries that we've been making in here. We can write all of these commands inside of a SQL file. And when this file gets executed, it gets executed within SQL as if I were manually writing these commands one by one. So let's go ahead and start with a SQL file by replicating the same information that we had before. So let's say I want to create a table. Let me go ahead and bring this back over here. Oh, that's not it. All right, so this table that we've created over here, I want to turn this table into a SQL query. I gave you guys an example earlier inside of psql on how to do that. So now I want you guys to walk me through doing it. So can anybody tell me what command I would use for creating a table?
Create table.
Table.
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and run create table. I want this. Okay, perfect. Students. What's next?
Open parentheses.
Right, got my open parentheses.
Then you would start with ID.
ID, which will be a serial.
Yes.
All
Primary
right,
key, I think.
primary key. Perfect.
And then the next one would be first underscore name. And I think you chose char. I don't remember how many you put in there though.
Okay, originally we went with 20. Let's go with 10 this time.
Okay. And then you would just continue going down the list. Last name char, age, int, grade char.
Is age a char as well?
That one's an integer.
Okay, and then finally grade. All right, do I need a comma after line 6?
No.
Awesome, and I don't need a comma after line 6 because it's already been created. All right, sorry, not because it's already been created, it's because it's my last argument. How do I close this SQL query?
Is it a semicolon?
Perfect. I'm gonna go ahead and pass a semicolon. Awesome. And now I can run the same exact command as I did before. I can copy students from, hopefully it's still there. Okay, and then it was data.csv. I really need to set up my VS Code so that it wraps. Delimiter, which is a comma. I hope I'm spelling that correctly. Let me go ahead and double check just to make sure. Option Z. Nice, thank you. I always misspell delimiter, so I want to make sure I'm doing it right. All right, so there's the delimiter. And next I can say CSV header to let it know that there's a CSV header. So this is going to copy everything out of my CSV file and place it in there. Well, now how do I execute this actual file? There's a couple of ways of doing it. I can execute it from within my command line, which we'll go over here shortly. Or I can execute it within SQL. I have a preference for executing it within SQL. I'm going to demonstrate doing it within SQL, and the reason why I will not be demonstrating the other way is because for the WSL users, if you try to do it from your command line, you may run into some permissions issues, and it may cause some unnecessary headaches that we don't necessarily need to deal with. So now instead, I'm going to try to execute this command by running -I. And when I run -I, well, I just need to know the path to my script. So I'm going to go ahead and let me try to just do students .sql. I'm pretty sure this is going to fail, but let me just try it. Yep, it's gonna fail because it's telling me that it doesn't know about any file or directory. So instead, I'm gonna run -I, not to resources, but instead to students.sql. I'm not going to place an S semicolon here because this isn't a SQL command. This isn't a Postgres command or something that has to do with SQL. This is something that has to do with the database itself. So this command will be executed, and it gives me a couple of things here. So here's my command, and it tells me psql was able to grab this file, but we found an error. The relationship to students already exists. Then it tells me not only does that already exist, but the first key that you tried to enter, it's a duplicate key. Currently, the key ID of 1 already exists as well. So it can't do anything. And then it gives me the context. Where did this error arise? And it tells me that it arose at line 2 from the copy students command. Okay. Awesome. So I expected to see that because I already had created everything. Well, how do I empty out my current database or my current table? So what I'm going to run is drop table if exist. I believe it's students if exist. Okay, let me make sure that that's the correct command. I don't know it off the top of my head because, like I said, SQL is the one thing that can always be oversight. So I'm going to run this drop table if exists here. Going to take a look at a couple of examples. Let's see.
Try drop table if exists and then students.
Drop table if exists and then students. Okay, yeah, let's try it out. That looks right.
I don't know. I don't think it worked for me either, so I don't know.
All right, so now if we run the -I, we can see that it was able to drop the table. So first it found our file. It saw that the table already exists. So it dropped the table and all the current entries that are inside of it, and then recreated the table with the new information that we passed into it. So now instead of 20 characters, it's only allowing for 10. And then it copied 5 entries into students. Now if I run select all from students, we can see that the same 5 students have been entered. Does anyone have any questions over how to utilize SQL files and how to run them within your PSQL terminal? Mike?
Yeah, just real quick. So if your CSV file, if it was dirty, if it didn't meet those parameters, then you would just start getting errors, at which point you would have to just go through and clean that CSV before you start trying to import everything.
Right. So if I had improper data here inside of my CSV file, let's actually try it out. Let's say that my CSV file, instead of A, had something like, actually instead of H, let's say we have something like 18. And I try to run that same SQL file. It's going to tell me, hey, I dropped the table. I created a new table, and it's going to create whichever ones it can. In this case, the very first error that I encountered happened at 18. So it tells me, hey, I can't create anything because of 18. if I run this select query that I did before, it's going to tell me that there's 0 rows. So if I were to take this out and place it down here, turn this back to 18, and I run it, oh, you can see that it has some invalid input, but it happened at line 9. Well, now when I run my select query, oh, I was wrong. So now if there's any, it goes through the entire CSV file first, figures out if there's any errors, and if there is, then they won't input anything into the database. All right. Does that answer your question, Mike?
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Of course. And let me turn that back into 18 so that it's nice and clean. All right. I see a question from Crystal. She's saying, are you using character 10 as an example for this lesson, or is there a logical purpose that you would want to limit characters to 10? That's a great question, Crystal. So when it comes to data, it occupies space. And a pain about data is that when you're running an actual SQL server, or it's actually running on deployment, it's consistently running and consistently using up space, regardless whether somebody's actually on your site interacting with it or not. It's always running and it's always occupying space. And it's going to occupy as much memory as you tell it that it needs to occupy. So if I were to leave this open for 255, although it may be a very small area of space that it'll occupy in the database, when the more and more entries that I get placed into my database, which hopefully it will be a lot if I'm working with an actual project that's going to be used by a lot of users, all those little spaces add up. And it's just data that it's just space that I don't need to occupy on my server. So in order to compensate for that, I want to make sure that I only leave the amount of characters or the only information that I need. That way I'm not occupying any unnecessary space. Does that answer your question, Crystal?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Tyler?
I just had a question on like if going through the demo, if this is just for demo purposes or if there's like a real purpose to, because like in the students PY, like every time we're adding or deleting a new student, like the whole student list is recreated then rewritten to the CSV, and then every time we're adding the database, we're dropping the table and then creating a whole new table. Is that just to demonstrate, or is there a reason you would want to do that? Because my intuition says like that would be inefficient if you had thousands and thousands of students.
Yeah, that's a great question. So to answer your question, what I'm demoing here is what you would do within your experimental phase, right? Before you actually
okay.
into the server and make these changes, you want to grab some dummy data or maybe some data that somebody provided to you that says, hey, this is safe to work with, because you don't ever want to work or alter directly with client data. So somebody will provide you some sort of data set or something that you can work with. And then from there, within your local machine or within your local development environment, you can start practicing the queries. Because like I said before, once you run it at the server level, there's no going back. Does that answer your question, Tyler?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. All right. So now pushing forward, we've gone over this information, how to create this, but this doesn't necessarily demonstrate that this is any different than what we were doing with Python, right? I don't see, other than making sure that my entries are correct, I don't see any other benefit. Well, let's try to insert a new student into this database. Let's go ahead and say I want to insert into students. And what I want to insert will be a first name basis. I don't have to worry about the ID. And actually, let's try with the ID first. Let's do ID, first name, last name, age, and grade. And actually, let's do this within our, let's do this within our SQL file. So I'm going to go ahead and insert student. Okay, well, when I insert the student, how does it know the values? Well, I'm going to specify with the following values. Now, when I tell it to grab the following values, it's going to expect a series of parentheses or somewhere along the line. So I'm going to go ahead and say, with these values, I want you to enter with the ID of 1. I want you to enter Francisco. And we haven't gone into validators and constraints. So as of right now, I can still have Francisco with a capital, with a lowercase letter. I can still have Avila with a lowercase letter. If I go ahead and enter something like 18, I believe it's going to turn it into numeric for us, but I may be wrong. And let's say that for grade, we just put 12. I'm going to kill this query right afterwards. And then I'm going to run select all from students. I don't think we need that anymore. All right. Let's go over to SQL. Actually, let's bring SQL right back down here. Let's run that same command. Let's execute this SQL file. Well, let's take a look at what happened. It looks like I still only have 5 students. Well, what happened with my insert level? So I have my drop table, my create table, 5, and then I tell it to run this insert. And it tells me, hey, the value is too long for type character of 1. Okay, well, where could that be coming from? Well, I said that the character for grade should only be 1. So let's say I run it to 2. And I'm going to execute the file. Okay, I still only have 5 entries. And now it's telling me that the key that I'm trying to place already exists. Okay, that's fair. 1 does exist, and it already exists in here. Okay, so what if I turned it into something like 7? Will that work? So now it worked. It was able to take in 7, Francisco, even though I put 18 as a string in my SQL file. It knows to interpret it into an integer, and this grade fell in as an actual alphabetic number. As an actual alphabet character, not as a number. So this is string 2, integer 18. Well, that's not necessarily what I want. Again, we haven't gone into constraints yet, so I can't control that just yet. So now let's try to change that value. Let's say I did a mistake. I made that entry. How could I alter this, right? Update. Yeah, we'll go into that here shortly. So we're going to go ahead and we see how the ID increased by 1. What happens if I remove the 7 and I turn this now into a B? Well, when I execute this query, we can see that I was able to take in 5 and everything else. Oh, I still told it to expect ID, so I'm going to remove that as well. Okay, so now it gave me another problem. So now I am running this duplicate key value violates unique constraint for students' primary key. So key of 1 already exists. So when I try to insert into the database without specifying what the ID will be, It's saying, hey, wait a minute, you already have 5 of them in here. So let's comment this out. I'm not going to be copying from my CSV file anymore. Well, now if I run it, I got 1. Okay. Let's see this a couple of times. And let's just run this as Francisco 2, 3, and 4. Well, now when I run this, let's take a look at the ID being serialized here. So the ID goes from 1, 2, 3, and 4. The initial command of insert runs with 1, but then after that, it knows to handle it and continuously move upwards. All right, well, we know that that's not working if I bring in the copy command. So let's check if there's anything that I can change here. So I'm going to specify the ID in this command one more time. And I'm going to go ahead and tell it that the ID will be 6. So now we get Francisco at the ID of 6. Well, I wonder if Francisco 2 will be able to go into my database, even though I'm not specifying the ID. Let's see what it does. Okay, so now without specifying the ID, it is consistently running into an error because when I ran the insert command, it thinks that my very first entry should still be 1. So if I am copying from a CSV and I'm inserting values into it afterwards, I need to make sure that I specify the ID file into that command. I see a question on the chat here that says, can someone explain what the difference in using the SQL file rather than the terminal where you are in Postgres? There actually isn't a difference. Everything that's happening here in SQL or in the SQL file is being executed in Postgres as if it was plain SQL. The benefit behind utilizing a SQL file is that you can look at your entire queries, see it from start to end, and alter each individual query to make sure that it's fitting what you want to, that it's fitting the behavior that you want it to execute. If it doesn't fit the behavior that you want it to execute, you can change it before executing it at a SQL level. And then this way, you have a record of all of the queries that you needed to run in order to achieve whatever task you're trying to accomplish. And then once it actually comes time to push it up to production or somebody approves it and somebody says, hey, this is okay, let's run it against our actual database, you can take this file and run it against the actual database that's in production attached to your project. Does that answer your question, Natalie?
Yes, thanks.
Of course. I see Brian. Is there a way to update the student's ID tracker table so that it picks up where the CSV import left off with ID of 6? There is a way. We're not going to be covering that today, but there definitely is a way to make sure that that change happens. Andrew is asking, is all the data from the table stored on your local machine at the moment? That's a great question, Andrew. And yes, all of the data that's currently here is still running inside of Postgres, right? All of this data is retaining space within my memory inside of my local machine. Does that answer your question, Andrew? Okay, I see a yes. Awesome. Tyler?
So we're using absolute path. Would we want to end up using a relative path when you actually like on a production level thing?
That's a great question. Yeah, we're currently using an absolute path. Why are we using an absolute path, and why wouldn't we want to utilize a relative path? So keep in mind, let me go ahead and see if I can demonstrate this. So once we actually go into looking at our deployed stack, or what this may look like once it's actually deployed. Ooh. You're going to notice that PostgreSQL isn't necessarily living anywhere within the stack. This may be bad example. Let me pull up a different page and draw something out. So let's say this is our computer, right? Our computer has different individual ports inside of it that's able to execute some sort of command or occupy some sort of space. Well, PostgreSQL is living within a port called 5432. And that port holds all of the information related to Postgres. Now, this doesn't necessarily interact with our actual machine. It could if we specifically tell it to, but our machine or the remainder of our machine is separate from Postgres. They're not intertwined, right? It's not saying, okay, well, now we can work together because we all exist within the same machine. It doesn't work that way. When we ran our live server yesterday, I believe it was running on port 66054 or somewhere along those lines. And that was just running our HTML template or the current directory at which live server was being executed, right? So live server has access to this specific directory, but it doesn't have access to the remaining of our machine. If we wanted to back out and go into the remaining of our machine, we could put relative paths into HTML, but that's because HTML or everything that's created at the place where I was executing live server was created at the machine level, right? All of these directories currently live in my desktop, and they are actually being, or this whiskey demos and nodes currently lives in my desktop, and it's actually linked to my machine. So because of that, think of its access being not bridged, right? It's not solidified. PostgreSQL doesn't work that way. PostgreSQL, oh wow, I can't spell, isn't actually, wow, isn't actually something that I created or that's connected to my desktop. It is within my machine, but to build relative paths coming out of PostgreSQL would be, I don't want to say impossible, but it would be more of a hassle than using an absolute path. And that's because of where it's connected. This is connected at the mount level, whereas this is connected at the user interface level. Like me and myself as a user can alter these files, whereas the machine, I would have to enter Postgres and then change everything within Postgres. So now in order for Postgres to find the files that live within my machine, I have to utilize an absolute path. Does that make sense, Tyler?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Of course. All right, and I see a question from Donnie on the chat saying, just curious, with the data being stored in our memory, just for computer power, is there a way to stop this when we need it? Or would we just stop when closing VS Code? All right, that's a great question. I'm not sure if Leandro might have already answered it, but to make sure that it is currently saved inside of our recording, I'm going to go ahead and cover this information as well. So when we installed a Postgres, we have it running as a background service. And I see something important that Donnie mentioned. Well, Donnie mentioned what happens when I close VS Code. Well, I know that live server, when I closed VS Code, live server stopped running. So it was no longer hosting my HTML template. And that's because live server is connected to VS Code, which VS Code is connected to my machine. And it's giving me access to it, right? That's why it's not blocked off like that. Well, Postgres isn't. Whether I close VS Code or VS Code stays open, or whether I put my computer to sleep, it doesn't turn off PostgreSQL. PostgreSQL is consistently running, which it might help my computer power if I go ahead and delete all those databases. But if I run something like brew services inside of my bash terminal or ZSH, whichever one it is that you want, this might take a while. Okay, it gives me a list of the services that are currently running. So here we can see that I have a couple of Postgres services inside of my computer. If you have something like a WSL machine and you run, I believe is sudo services. I think that's it. I think it's just sudo services. If somebody has a WSL machine, you know how to enter this, please let me know if that's a correct command, but I'm pretty sure it's just sudo services. And you'll be able to see all of the different services that are currently running on your machine and on which port. So here in Brew, it tells me that I have an older version of PostgreSQL at 14. Its status is none, meaning it's not running. It is currently installed at the root level. And it does not offer me a file path because it's installed at the root level. Well, now the next one that I have is 15. And this one says that the service is started, meaning that it's running. And that it's running at with the current user, Francisco Avila, which is myself. And it even gives me a path to be able to find where Postgres 15 is currently located. Well, now let's say I wanted to stop Postgres. Well, I can say brew services stop, and then I believe it should be PostgreSQL at 15. So now it's attempting to stop brew services 15, and it stopped it successfully, which means that if I try to run some sort of SQL query here, it's going to give me an error. All right, so now I try to run some sort of SQL query and it told me, hey, the connection doesn't exist anymore. PostgreSQL stopped unexpectedly. I don't know what's happening, but the server was lost. So here it tells me connection to server was lost. So currently, port 5432, which is where PSQL is looking for a database, no longer has Postgres running inside of it. Well, let's fix that. If I wanted to run it again, I can say brew services start. And I can say PostgreSQL at 15. And now it tells me it successfully started brew services. Again, I can run brew services to make sure that it has actually been started. We can see that version 15 has been started. Now I can enter PSQL students and run that same SQL query and get the same output. Does that answer your question, Donnie?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions regarding how to utilize SQL files? Okay, great. So we just went over SQL files. Now let's do a quick introductory to some SQL queries. What information can I grab out of SQL through the SQL queries? And let me go ahead and comment this insert into students out. I just want to work with the current CSV data that we have. Okay, I can see that I have those 5 students. That's great. Now that I have those 5 students, I don't necessarily need all of these headers anymore, or this drop table if exists. I have the data that I need already inputted. Now I just want to work on the different queries. What is it that I want to know about these students? We already went over select all. Well, what if I wanted to select specific columns from these students? What if all I wanted to do is know the first name and last name? Well, I can run select first name, last name from students. Now, when I run this file, we can see that the only thing that gets returned in this table is the first name and last name. I'm not going to go into aliases as of now. Notice that they show up as first underscore name. Later on, when we go into SQL, we can learn how to add some aliases to these queries so that they don't show up in that way. And you'll even learn how to combine these two tables so that it shows up as first and last name. All right, well, what if I wanted to do some conditional argument? What if I only wanted the first and last name of the students that have a letter grade equal to A? Well, I'm going to start breaking up this query here. I want to select first and last name from students where the grade is equal to the letter A. Now, if I run this command, it tells me that only John and Emily have this letter A. Now, this is happening a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently than if I were to write it in Python. I would have to iterate through the list, figure out which one of them have the letter A, make a new list, and after that, I would have to print out the information for the user. Now, all I need to do is tell SQL, hey, I want you to give me this information from this table where this condition is being met. Any questions over conditional statements and the selecting partial parameters so far? Go ahead, Saul.
Can you do more than one conditional, or do you have to do one at a time?
Okay, great. Yeah, that's an awesome question. Can I do more than one conditional, or do I have to do more than do I have to do one at a time? Okay, so let's go ahead and do a separate one. Let's go ahead and say I want them if they have the letter A and if their age is greater than 18. Well, I can do and age greater than 18. It's going to give me 0 because none of them have that information. Okay, let's see. What if I want A or B? I think that would work. Let's do that. I think that will work as well. Okay, so it's going to grab the people who have grade in A or B, who have a grade of A or a B, and their age is greater than 18. So it returns Jane, which Jane Smith is older than 18, and she has a letter grade of B. And it returns Michael Brown. Michael Brown is older than 18 and has a letter grade of B. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, well, what if I wanted counts, right? What if I want to know how many of these is it that I'm grabbing by? Or what if I wanted to know the grade and how many of those students have that specific grade? Well, let's comment this out so that we have that query in our notes. Let's grab this following information. Well, I want to grab the grade. And then there's a couple of mathematical functions that I can also run within SQL, such as count. I want to know the count of all of the students and again, we won't go into aliases just yet. I want to do this from the table of students. And where I want it to grab by is where, oh, sorry. In this case, I don't want a where. In this case, I actually want a group. So if we look at our data, we can see that multiple entries have the same grade. And I want a count of them, meaning that I want to group them in some specific way. Well, I want to group my entries by their grade. And now when I run this, we can see that out of all of my students, 2 of them have the letter B, 1 of them has a letter grade of C, and 2 have the letter grade of A. if I were to move forward into something like sorting, let's say I wanted to see all of the students. And I just want to see their name, actually. Their first name from students. And I want to order them in a specific way. I want to sort them. Well, I want to order them by last name. And why not? We can see we have them ordered now by last name in alphabetical order. Well, what if I wanted it backwards? Well, I can place it into descending order. And by placing it into descending order, I'm now flipping that table upside down. The last thing that I want to demonstrate today is going to be, what if I'm getting too much input? I don't want to know this many information or this much information. I only want to know 3 students. Let's say I want to grab the last 3 students from the class. Well, I can add a limit. I'm going to go ahead and place it into descending order. And then I want to limit my output by 3, meaning that I only wanted to return the top 3 students of that result. And that is all the SQL queries that we will be covering today. All right, so in summary today, we covered why databases, utilizing CSV with Python to retain data, and why we would want to utilize RDBMSs. Additionally, we also covered how to work within PostgreSQL, understanding which port PostgreSQL is running in comparison to our local host, or how our machine is accessing PostgreSQL. We also learned about the retention of data, writing SQL files, or creating SQL data table diagrams, copying information from a CSV into our database, inserting information into our data table, and then after that, we covered SQL queries. At this point, does anyone have any questions over any of the material that was covered today? All right, if there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording.